He found her. After 8 months of silence. After the new city, the new number, the new name on the lease. After she had finally stopped checking over her shoulder at every gala, every lobby, every crowded elevator, he found her. David stepped out of the shadows of the penthouse balcony the way he always did. Not loud, not rushed, just suddenly there, between her and the door, filling the space with that particular brand of calm that had always been worse than shouting. Lily. That was all he said. Her name, in that voice. She felt her body do what her body had been trained to do, go very still. Stop breathing. Make herself small against the marble balustrade as the city lights blurred 40 floors below her. Her emerald gown caught the wind coming off the skyline. She did not move. David's jaw worked slowly. He looked her up and down the way a man inspects something he believes belongs to him. "You look good," he said. "New dress, new crowd." He tilted his head. Same scared eyes. He stepped closer. His frame was massive in the black t-shirt stretched across his shoulders. The frame she had once felt press her into walls, into silence, into a version of herself she had spent 8 months trying to bury. She pressed her back against the stone railing. The city yawned open behind her. His arm came up. A hand closed around his wrist, not from in front. From behind, appearing from nowhere, or from everywhere at once. One hand, not two. The grip was not a shove, not a struggle. It was a lock. Absolute and immediate, the way a door closes on a room and the sound dies. David's fist stopped in midair. Yaji stepped around him in one motion, unhurried, placing himself between David and Lily without releasing the grip. He turned. The man standing behind him was not what anyone would have expected. He was not built like a bodyguard. He was not the tallest man on the balcony. He wore a dark navy button-down shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and where the fabric ended, tattoos began intricate. Blackwork ink that ran from his knuckles all the way up his forearms in patterns that did not look decorative. They looked like a record, like something written in a language made of violence and survival. His dark hair was immaculate. His posture did not shift when David's full weight tested the grip. He held David's wrist with one hand and looked at him with eyes so flat and so still and so completely without heat that David's mouth opened and produced no sound at all. "Touch her," the man said, and his voice was quiet, the way a blade is quiet and you lose that hand. He released the wrist. David stepped back. His body made that decision. His pride arrived late and found nothing left to defend. The man did not watch him. He turned. He looked at Lily at the way she was pressed against the railing, at the emerald gown rippling in the night air, at her hands gripping the stone balustrade behind her, at the exact expression on her face. Not relief yet. Not yet. Something frozen between the past and whatever this was. Her eyes were wide and wet and burning, and her chin was up, and she had not made a single sound through any of it. He looked at her the way no one at that gala had looked at her all evening, like she was the only thing on that balcony worth seeing. His name was Ya-ji. The gala was his hosted, as it was every year, at his penthouse above the city, where the guest list was curated by people who understood that an invitation was also a message about who you were allowed to know. He had been at the bar inside all evening, drinking nothing and watching a woman in green hold herself together with a precision that had nothing to do with the evening gown and everything to do with what was underneath it. He had noticed her the moment she arrived, the way she scanned every room before she entered it, the way she smiled at strangers with her mouth but kept her eyes free. He had recognized it immediately, because he had spent 20 years learning to read danger in a person's posture. He had watched the evening unfold. He had watched David appear. He had watched Lily's shoulders change the moment she saw him. When David's arm came up, Yaji was already moving. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was still quiet, unhurried, the voice of a man who has never needed volume to be understood. Lily looked at him, at the tattoos still visible where he'd rolled his sleeves, at the absolute calm on his face, standing between her and the man who had been her nightmare for 3 years. At David, behind him, who was breathing fast and saying nothing and had somehow become the smallest person on the balcony. She looked back at Yaji. "No," she said. He nodded once. The way a man nods when he has already decided what comes next and is simply giving you the courtesy of finishing the conversation. He turned and walked back toward the balcony doors. He left space behind him open, and hers, if she chose it. She picked up her clutch from the balcony chair. She did not look at David. "Lily." David's voice came after her, tight and rising. "Lily, we're not done." She kept walking. The doors closed. And somewhere behind her, in the city that stretched below 40 floors of marble and chandelier light, David's voice disappeared. Within 24 hours, so would everything else about him. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I would absolutely love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is already traveling. She called his number 7 times. The first time, it rang. That was almost worse, the idea that he was somewhere, phone in hand, choosing not to answer. By the third call, it went straight to voicemail. By the fifth, the automated voice told her the number was no longer in service. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed in the gray, early morning light, still in the emerald gown, shoes still on, and stared at her phone the way a person stares at something they cannot explain. She tried his social media next. The accounts were gone. Not deactivated, gone. No archived profile, no ghost page, no mutual connections pointing toward a trace. David's Instagram, which he had curated like a man who believed the world needed proof of his existence, had vanished as completely as if it had never been created. His LinkedIn, the Facebook he only used to check on people from his past. The number for his office, which she still had memorized against her will, rang to a line that said it had been disconnected. Lily set the phone down on the bedspread. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the man on the balcony, the tattoos, the single hand closing around David's wrist like a door being shut. She thought about the voice. Touch her and you lose that hand. She thought about how David had stepped back. David, who had never stepped back from anything in his life. She got up, went to the bathroom, and stood in the shower until the water ran cold. She was dressed jeans, a white blouse, hair pulled back because she needed control over something when the knock came at her door. 3 measured raps, not rushed, not tentative. The knock of someone who already knew she was on the other side. She did not move toward the door immediately. Old habit. "Miss Morgan." A man's voice, low and professional. "Mr. Yaji sent us." She looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark suits stood in the corridor. They were not small. They were not trying to appear casual. They stood the way soldiers stand when they have been told not to stand like soldiers, which is to say, exactly like soldiers. She opened the door. The taller one spoke. "Mr. Yaji would like you to come with us, for your safety." He said it the way people say things they have been told to say precisely, word for word, without elaboration. "And if I say no?" Lily asked. The man considered this with the expression of someone who had not been given instructions for that particular variable. He said, "You might say that," the man offered after a moment. "He said to tell you that the people who found David last night did not find him on their own." Lily looked at him. She picked up her bag from the chair. The car was black, and without any identifying marks, the kind of vehicle that exists to be invisible in cities that notice everything. They drove for 40 minutes, leaving the downtown grid and climbing into the elevated private roads that wound behind the hills, where the houses sat back from the street behind gates, and landscaping so immaculate it looked like the vegetation itself had signed a non-disclosure agreement. The estate materialized behind a black iron gate that opened without the car slowing. Lily did not say anything as they pulled up the stone driveway. She looked. She was good at looking without appearing to. The grounds were enormous, and deliberately, elegantly overwhelming manicured lawns under old trees, a fountain at the center of the approach, with no decorative excess, just clean, moving water. 4 men stood at visible intervals along the outer perimeter. She counted at least 2 more she caught only in her peripheral vision, not at posts but moving. Patrolling. The house itself was not what she had expected. She had braced for something aggressive, baroque and gilded, the architecture of men who want you to know they have money. Instead, it was clean, angular, all dark stone and glass, built into the hillside as if it had grown there. Expensive the way silence is expensive, the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself because it has never needed to. She was shown inside by a woman, which surprised her, a small, composed Korean woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Mrs. Shin, offered tea without waiting for an answer, and led Lily through a corridor lined with narrow windows that framed the city below like paintings. Her room was on the 2nd floor. It had its own bathroom, a wardrobe that someone had already stocked with her approximate size, which unsettled her more than the guards had. and a window that looked out over the back gardens, where the hills ran dark and uninterrupted behind the find. Property. There was no lock on the outside of her door. She checked. She spent the first 2 hours in that room, thinking. She found Yaji on the 3rd floor. She had not been told not to explore. She suspected that was intentional. The house felt like a test being administered through architecture. Here is freedom. Here are its invisible edges. Let's see how you move within them. She moved up the stairs with her hand trailing the iron railing and emerged into a long, open room that served as both a study and something harder to name. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk near the windows with a view that swallowed the entire city, and Yaji, standing with his back to her at the window, a phone to his ear, speaking Korean in a quiet and final-sounding voice. He turned when he heard her. He did not look surprised. He ended the call without closing the conversation with the person on the other end, simply lowered the phone and set it on the desk, as if the interruption required no acknowledgement. He was dressed differently than the night before dark trousers. A black shirt with the sleeves already rolled up, revealing the tattoos she had spent the car ride trying not to think about. In the daylight, they were more complex than she had registered on the balcony. They moved across his forearms in dense, interlocking patterns that faded darker toward his knuckles. In the morning light filtering through the glass, they looked ancient. "You slept," he said. "A little," she said, which was not the conversation she had come upstairs to have. She looked at him directly. "Where is David?" He looked back at her. His face was exactly as it had been on the balcony, composed, flat, entirely unhurried. "Somewhere he cannot reach you," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm giving you." She felt the frustration move through her chest and kept it out of her face. She was good at that, too. "Is he alive?" A pause. Not hesitation, he didn't strike her as someone who hesitated. Something more deliberate. He was deciding how much to hand her. "Yes," he said. She absorbed this. "Did you—" She stopped. She didn't know how to finish the question. "Did you hurt him? Did you do what I spent 3 years wanting someone to do? Did you do what I am ashamed I still want?" "I handled it," Yaji said, and his voice did not offer anything beyond those 3 words. She crossed her arms. "I didn't ask to be brought here." "No," he agreed. "But you came." She hadn't had a response to that on the drive up, and she didn't have one now. She looked out his window at the city sprawling below the same city David had apparently ceased to exist in, overnight, at this man's instruction, and felt the particular vertigo of standing on ground that had shifted without warning. "How long?" she asked. "Until it's safe." "And who decides when that is?" He met her eyes. "I do," he said. Not unkindly. Not like a man who enjoyed saying it. Just like a man stating a fact about the way the world worked from where he was standing. She turned and went back down the stairs. She didn't argue. She wasn't sure that was wisdom. She wasn't sure it wasn't surrender. She filed the question away to answer later, the way she had filed away so many things during the years with David, except that this felt different in a way she couldn't isolate. David had taken. This man had given her a room with no lock on the outside. She ate the dinner Mrs. Shin brought. She slept a full night for the first time in 8 months, and did not examine why too closely. She had been there 4 days when she asked about the tattoos. It happened in the kitchen. She had begun to move around the house more freely, not because the anxiety had lifted entirely, but because standing still had started to feel like something David would have approved of, and so she moved. She found the kitchen at 6 in the morning, which was apparently when Yaji also found the kitchen. He was making coffee in the precise, methodical way she was beginning to understand was his register for everything. Not performative, just exact. He did not seem startled to find her in the doorway, though she had been quiet. "You don't sleep much," she said. "I sleep when there's nothing to watch," he said. She got a glass of water and stood at the counter, and for a while they didn't speak. The house was genuinely quiet at that hour, no guards audible, no movement from Mrs. Shin's wing, just the low sound of the coffee maker, and the dark city lights still blinking distantly behind the kitchen windows. She was watching his hands while he poured. She didn't realize she was doing it until he set the coffee pot down and she had already asked, "What do they mean?" He turned, looked at his own hands with a kind of neutrality, as though they belonged to someone he had known a long time and had finished having opinions about. "Some of them are rank," he said. "Status. In the organization." He turned his right forearm slightly toward the light. A thick band of interlocking geometric forms ran just below the elbow. This was the first. I was 19. She looked at it. What does rank look like when you're at the top? You run out of arm, he said. She wasn't expecting it to be almost funny. She didn't quite smile, but something shifted in her face, and she saw him notice it. She pulled her own sleeves down, a reflex, before she remembered she was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. There was nothing on her arms. The things David had left on her were not visible the way tattoos were visible. They were deeper and more poorly distributed, woven into the way she held her breath when a door opened too fast, the way she tracked exits. She hadn't thought Yaji had noticed. "You flinch," he said. His voice was the same temperature it always was. No pity in it, which was the only reason she didn't turn away. "I know," she said. "When a hand moves too quickly. When someone comes up from behind." She said nothing. "You've been here 4 days," he said, "and I have not once approached you from behind, or moved quickly in your vicinity." He said it like a man noting something he had done as a matter of course, not seeking recognition. "I wanted you to know it was deliberate." She looked at him. In 3 years with David, and in the 8 months since, no one had ever said anything like that to her. Most people who knew what David had done offered her the particular kind of concern that was mostly about making themselves feel useful. They leaned toward her. They explained things. They moved at full speed through her peripheral vision, and then apologized after she flinched and looked at her with that expression, that gentle, mortifying expression that made her feel like evidence of something. Yaji had simply rearranged how he moved through his own house and told her about it afterward. She turned back to his forearms. "Show me the rest," she said. "If you want." He held out both arms in the light. She looked without touching. He did not explain each one unbidden, he answered when she pointed, and otherwise was quiet. And she understood that this was how he did most things. He did not fill silence. Silence, in his hands, had a different texture than it had with most people. She did not tell him about David, not the details. But at some point during that hour in the kitchen, she stopped tracking the nearest exit. And she noticed she had stopped. And she did not start again. She asked Yaji on the 5th day if she could go back to her apartment. She needed clothes that were hers. She needed to check her mail. She needed, more than either of those things, to prove to herself that she still had a life that existed outside this house, that she was here by choice, and not by the slow sedative of gilded walls and the company of a man who moved through rooms like weather. Yaji looked at her across the desk in his study. "I'll have someone take you," he said. "I don't need someone to take me. I can take a car." "Yes," he said. "You can." He picked up his phone and said something in Korean. Within 3 minutes, a car was arranged. One of his men in the front. No argument, no negotiation, the concession given so cleanly that she couldn't find anything to push back against. She went back to her apartment. It looked exactly as she'd left it, keys on the hook, dishes from 3 days ago still on the drying rack, the particular smell of her own life. She stood in the center of her living room for a long moment and breathed it. Then she packed a bag, checked her mail bills, a magazine, nothing, and watered her plants. She was locking her door when she noticed the car, black, parked across the street, which meant nothing, except that it had not been there when she arrived. And the man behind the wheel was not looking at his phone, not reading, not doing any of the things people do when they park. He was watching her building the way Yaji's guards watched the estate perimeter. She got into the car without acknowledging what she'd seen. On the drive back, she told Yaji's man. There was a car parked on Alden Street, dark. The driver was watching the building. The man's eyes moved to the rearview mirror. He said nothing, but he picked up his phone. By the time they reached the estate, she could feel some shift in the atmosphere, the particular quality of attention that moved through the house when something had been confirmed. 2 guards who had been at the outer gate were now inside the foyer. Mrs. Shin disappeared from the common areas. Yaji came to find her. "You saw it," he said. "Is it connected to you? Or to David? Both possibilities are being evaluated." He paused. "I'm moving you to my private quarters." She looked at him. "For your safety," he said. "My rooms are at the center of the building. No external windows, no lines of sight from the perimeter." She held his gaze. She thought about the car. She thought about the man who had been able to erase David from every database, every network, every register of existence overnight. She thought about the fact that this man, dangerous, tattooed, Running an organization whose precise nature she was still assembling from fragments had not once, in 5 days, done anything to her that she hadn't chosen. "Show me the room," she said. His private quarters were not what she'd imagined. She wasn't sure what she'd imagined, something more exposed, perhaps, more self-conscious. Instead, they were spare and deeply quiet. A large bed, dark linen, shelves of books and documents, a second desk. No decorative excess. The room of a man who spent a great deal of time in it and had arranged it accordingly, with no audience in mind. There was a smaller adjoining room with its own bed, and he showed her to that without any suggestion of the arrangement being anything other than what he said it was. "You'll be secure here," he said. "Thank you," she said, because she meant it, and because it cost her something to mean it, and she was trying to be honest about the things that cost her something. He left her to settle. She sat on the edge of the bed in the adjoining room and listened to the house breathe. She did not feel like a prisoner. She was not entirely sure what she felt like. Something new. Something without a good name for it yet. She heard them on the 6th night. She had not been trying to listen. She had come down to the kitchen for water, barefoot, and the voices from the room behind the east corridor carried more clearly than they probably should have. She pressed her back against the wall in the dark hallway and did not move. There were 3 of them, speaking Korean. She didn't speak Korean, but one voice she recognized lower, clipped. She had seen the man 3 days ago at the entrance to the east corridor, a lieutenant named Cho, who had looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided is a mistake. She had heard that same voice in the study once before, carrying through a closed door while Ya-ji conducted what sounded like a disciplinary conversation with someone who had made an error. Then she heard a word she recognized. Her name, in a Korean mouth. She heard it twice. Then the low voice Ya-ji responded, and whatever he said produced a silence that stretched across the room behind the closed door. When the conversation resumed, it was quieter, more careful. She went back upstairs without the water. She sat in the dark room and thought about the things she knew and didn't know. She knew Ya-ji had ordered the car for her at her request with no resistance. She knew he had told her David was alive. She knew he had rearranged his own movement through his house, so she wouldn't flinch. She also knew that whatever he was, and she wasn't foolish enough to soften it, the word the people around him were using when they spoke about her was not warmth. It was not wonder. Based on the quality of the silence that had followed his response, it was a problem. His distraction. That was how they saw her. She didn't need the language to hear that. In the morning, she came downstairs earlier than usual. Ya-ji was already at his desk, and she stood in the doorway of the study until he looked up. "Your people don't want me here," she said. He put down the pen. "They don't get a vote," he said. "That's not the point." She came into the room. "What is this? Honestly, because I've been trying to be fair to you and I think you've been fair to me. In your way, but I overheard enough last night to know your lieutenants are not pleased about whatever you think this is. And I don't know what you think this is." He leaned back. He looked at her with that flat, unhurried gaze and was quiet for long enough that another person might have spoken to fill it. Lily did not. "You are under my protection," he said finally, "because you decided that." "Yes, without asking me. You were in danger. I made a decision. You are here, and you are safe. These things are sequential." She turned and looked out the window at the city again. "And David is not in a position to make decisions anymore." She absorbed this. The thing she had decided she didn't want to know sat in the center of her chest, familiar and troubling, and shot through with a shame she had been managing since the morning she'd found every trace of him gone. She had been relieved. She was still relieved. That was the problem, not the relief itself, but how clean it was, how total, how much she owed it to a man she did not entirely understand, who was feared by everyone in his own house, and who had, 6 days ago, stepped between her and a raised hand without being asked. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. She was telling herself as much as him. "I know," he said. "I'm not certain I trust you either." "That's reasonable," he said, "but I'm still here." He looked at her. And for just a fraction of a moment, less than a second, the length of a breath, something moved across his face that was not the flat, professional calm he wore like a second skin. Something she could not name, and was not sure she was meant to see. "Yes," he said. "You are." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she crossed to the bookshelf because she needed something to do with her hands, and she pulled out the first book her fingers landed on and she sat down in the chair by the window and opened it. She wasn't reading. She suspected he knew she wasn't reading. But he picked up his pen and returned to the papers on his desk, and the room settled into the particular quiet that she had begun, against her own intentions, to look forward to. Outside, the city stretched in every direction. Somewhere in it, someone had been watching her building. Somewhere in it, David existed in a form she hadn't been told the shape of. Somewhere below the East Corridor, 3 men had spoken her name with the particular edge of people who have decided that something is a liability. In the room she was sitting in, a man in a navy shirt with ink across his hands was working through a stack of documents, and not once had he moved too quickly, raised his voice, or made her feel like anything other than a person who was allowed to take up space. She turned a page she hadn't read. She would figure out what that meant. Later, when the city stopped watching and the men in the corridor found something else to worry about and she had enough ground under her feet to think clearly, for now she stayed. She found it by accident. She had not been looking for anything. It was the 9th day, and she had developed a rhythm inside the estate, the way water develops a rhythm inside a container, finding the available channels, moving along them, morning coffee in the kitchen. The study, if Yaji was working there, and the quiet between them felt like something she wanted to be inside. The back gardens in the afternoon when the sun hit the hills at a low angle, and the guards gave her a respectful distance that no longer felt like surveillance. She had been in the study alone. Yaji had stepped out to take a call, and she had been doing what she now did most afternoons, reading something from his shelf that she was actually reading this time, not performing. A history of the Korean peninsula that she'd picked up without any particular intention and found herself genuinely inside. The folder was on the desk. Not hidden, not locked away, set on the corner in the way that objects are set somewhere temporarily, with the intention of returning, by a person who lives alone and has never needed to conceal what he does in his own house. She would have ignored it. She had been ignoring the desk's contents as a matter of principle, a private contract she'd made with herself about the limits of what she was entitled to know. But the edge of a photograph was visible at the folder's corner. A photograph of a building she recognized. Her old apartment. The one she'd left before moving to this city. The one David had found her in the first time she'd tried to leave. She pulled the folder toward her. She told herself she would only look at the photograph. She looked at everything. It was thorough in the way that only institutional thoroughness can be, not one document but dozens, organized in a sequence that told a story from its first page to its last, with the brisk clarity of a case file. David's financials were first. Not summaries, the actual accounts, opened and displayed like maps. She saw the balance on the morning after the gala. She saw it 12 hours later. The money had not been withdrawn. It had been redistributed with a precision that left no legal trace, routed through a structure of shell entities that terminated in a non-profit organization she had to read the name of 3 times before it registered. The Lily Morgan Foundation for Domestic Abuse Survivors. She sat with that for a long time. The foundation was real. She could see the registration documents, the charitable status filing, the initial endowment, David's money, David's bank accounts, drained and redirected, all of it now building something in her name that would outlast whatever was left of him. She turned the page. The next section was David himself. His identity, documented and then systematically unwound. His social security number flagged across credit systems. His professional licenses suspended through complaints filed with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of every organization David had cultivated a relationship with. His passport. She stared at the page. His passport had been rendered invalid through a process she could not follow, but whose endpoint was clear. He could not travel internationally. He could not access his accounts. He could not prove, in any meaningful sense, who he was to any institution that required proof. And then the last page. A location. Coordinates and a facility name, in the kind of region that does not appear on tourist maps. A labor camp. Off-grid. Not a prison, the distinction was clear to her, even through the bureaucratic language of the document. Something private. Something that operated without oversight by anyone other than the people Yaji owned. David was alive. He was working. He had no phone, no network, no account, no name that anyone would recognize, no access to any system through which he might contact a lawyer, or a family member, or the woman he had spent 3 years making small and afraid. He had been stripped. Not killed. Stripped. His ego, his power, His money, his identity, all of it dismantled and distributed, or discarded or repurposed, with a methodical patience that had begun within hours of the balcony assembled overnight, with the particular efficiency of a man who, once he decides something, encounters no version of the world in which he does not finish it. She closed the folder and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She stood at the window with her arms crossed over her chest for a long time, and she made herself be honest about everything she felt, one thing at a time. Terror, yes, clean and immediate, because the capacity required to do what she'd just read was not the capacity of a man who lost control, or who acted from passion, or who could be reasoned back from an edge. It was the capacity of someone for whom the dismantling of a human life was a matter of execution, a problem identified, resourced, and closed. And then, underneath that, despite everything she knew about herself and what she valued and the world she had wanted to build relief, the kind of relief she had not allowed herself since the night David had first raised his hand, because she had learned that relief was premature, that he always came back, that safety was not a destination she was permitted to reach. That relief, now, was so complete and so long denied that it rose through her chest like water through dry ground, filling spaces she had forgotten were empty. She was afraid of Yaji. She was also, for the first time in 3 years, not afraid of anything else. She did not know what to do with both things being true at once. She stood there until she heard his steps on the stairs, and then she sat back down and opened the book on her lap and looked at a page she was not reading. He came back into the room. He went to his desk. He noticed, she was certain, that the folder was fractionally closer to the center than he'd left it. He did not say anything. He sat down, opened it, and continued working. She looked up. "The foundation," she said. He met her eyes. "You filed it in my name," she said. "Yes. Before you asked me. You would have said no," he said. "You would have said it was too much. You would have been polite about it and meant it, and it would have been the wrong decision." He looked at her steadily. "I made the right decision." She should have been angrier about that. She measured how angry she was, and it was less than she wanted it to be, because he was also correct, and she was tired of lying to herself about the things she knew. "The place you sent him," she said. "He's working," Yaji said. "He eats. He sleeps." He paused. "He has no power. Over anything. That condition is permanent." She looked at her hands. "You built a whole system." "I built what was appropriate," he said. "What he deserves is different. I made a practical decision." The distinction was subtle and clear, and she sat inside it for a moment. What he deserves. She thought about what David deserved. She thought about all the women David would have found after her, if he had been left intact and free and funded. "Okay," she said. Yaji looked at her. "Okay," she said again, because she had made a decision about something, and it was not about David at all. She made the choice the way she made most of her real choices, not loudly, and not all at once. It had been forming for days in the accumulated silences, in the kitchen at 6 a.m, in the precise and deliberate way he managed the space between them, in the moment he'd told her he had rearranged how he moved through his own house, and had not waited for her gratitude. That night she stayed in the study after dinner. Mrs. Shin had long since gone to her rooms. The guards had cycled to their positions. The house was in its nighttime register, not silent exactly, but internal, like a breath held with intention. Yaji was at his desk. She was in the chair by the window. The reading lamp made a contained pool of yellow light over her book and his papers. She looked up. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze and did not look away. "I know what you are," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know what you've done. Not just to David in general. What you run, what that requires." She kept her voice level. "I'm not pretending any of that is something I can categorize as safe or simple." He was quiet. "I'm also not running," she said. "I want you to know I've decided that. Not because I don't have options, and not because I'm afraid of what happens if I leave. I've decided because I want to stay." He stood up from the desk. He walked toward her, and she watched him come and did not make herself smaller. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and his hand came up slowly. She tracked the motion, and he held it still just below her line of sight for a moment, giving her every fraction of a second she needed to know it was coming, before his fingers touched the side of her face. She did not flinch. The stillness between them opened up into something neither of them had names for yet, and she stood, because sitting felt like a posture she'd grown out of, and when she stood, she was close enough to feel the warmth coming off his shirt. "You understand what staying means," he said. Not a question, a contract offered. "I'm starting to," she said. He kissed her the way he did everything, without haste, without performance, like a man who has made a decision and has no remaining doubts about it. She kissed him back like a woman who had been clenching every muscle in her body against the world for 3 years and had finally, in this precise location, been given permission to let go. The city glittered below the window. The guards moved along the perimeter. The house breathed around them, and Lily Morgan, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, was not afraid. She did not see it coming. In hindsight, she would understand that was the point. The betrayal was engineered by someone who knew exactly how she moved through the estate, when she was alone, which cameras had the softest angles. It came from inside the information. There was no other way it could have been so precise. It was 11 days after the gala. 12 days after David had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. She was in the back garden at the hour she always walked there, the guards at their usual intervals, the afternoon light on the hills, the familiar shape of a routine that had begun to feel like peace. She had her phone in her hand. She was looking at photographs of a city she'd once lived in and thinking, abstractly, that she might want to go back one day. Not to leave, just to visit. With Yaji, maybe. Thinking about what it would mean to think about the future. The gardener she'd seen twice before that week was working at the far hedge. She had paid him no particular attention. That was also the point. The second man came from the tree line. The third materialized from the side passage behind the garden wall, the one she'd never seen a guard posted at because it connected only to the maintenance yard and had always been locked. It was not locked today. She had time to open her mouth and not time to produce a sound before something covered her face, not violent, practiced, professional, and the garden tilted and the phone hit the stone path and she was gone from the estate as completely and as quickly as David had been gone from the world. The room they brought her to was not what fear imagined. She had expected a basement, something punitive. Instead, it was a mid-rise apartment, clean and stripped of personality, with the particular atmosphere of a space used for purposes its original landlord had not anticipated. 3 men in the outer room, 1 woman who brought her water and said nothing. Her wrists were zip-tied in front of her, not behind, which she noted carefully because it was either careless or deliberate, and either one was useful information. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed and thought. She thought about the syndicate's whisper, the voices behind the corridor door, the way her name had sounded in someone else's language, not warmly. She thought about the word liability and the way power structures move when the person at the top develops what looks, to the people beneath, like a vulnerability. She thought about what Yaji would do, and then she stopped thinking about what Yaji would do and started thinking about what she could do, because she had not spent 3 years with David without learning something about the particular arithmetic of survival, how to read a room, how to read men, how to identify the weakest point in a system not by its most visible elements but by its assumptions. The assumption here was that she was a woman who needed rescuing. The assumption was that she would wait. The woman who'd brought the water had left a glass with a smooth, cylindrical base on the nightstand. When the guard who checked on her at 40-minute intervals came to the door, she was sitting on the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and he looked at her for 3 seconds and determined she was contained. That was the assumption. Her hands being in front made the difference. She had the zip tie against the edge of the bed frame within 30 seconds of his footsteps fading something she could not have managed behind her back, and something whoever had tied her had not thought carefully enough about. Yaji got the message at 4:47 inches the afternoon. It was a photograph of the back garden. Lily's phone on the stone path, a single line of Korean beneath it that translated to, "Come alone, or she doesn't come back." The man who had been standing next to him when the message arrived told the story afterward not widely, because most of the people he would have told were no longer employed by Yaji by the end of that night, and several were no longer in a position to tell anything to anyone. But he described it, once, to Mrs. Shin, who had been with Yaji for 15 years and had thought she had a complete picture of what he was capable of. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the photograph. He set the phone down on the desk. He stood very still for approximately 4 seconds, and then something behind his eyes changed. It was not anger, exactly. Anger is hot. This was the opposite of hot. This was the removal of every ambient temperature from the room, the thing that happens when a man who has spent 20 years building absolute control over every dimension of his own nature decides that control is no longer required, because everything that required protecting has been placed at risk. He made 2 calls, both under 30 seconds. Then he put on his jacket, took the gun from the desk drawer that no one on his staff had ever seen him use personally, and walked out of the study. The car left the estate with 6 vehicles behind it. The address had not been in the message. It didn't need to be. The traitor was a man named Cho, who had been with the organization for 11 years and had the rank to access security schedules and camera rotations and maintenance yard lock codes. Cho also had a property in his cousin's name in the financial district that Yaji's people had found, cross-referenced, and confirmed within 19 minutes of the photograph arriving. 23 minutes after Lily's phone hit the garden path, Yaji's convoy was moving through the city. He said nothing in the car. The men with him did not speak to each other. The city moved past the windows at speed, and the lights blurred in the early dark, and Yaji sat in the center of the back seat with his hands open on his knees and his eyes focused on something no one else in the vehicle could see. She had gotten one wrist free. The bed frame edge was slower than she'd hoped, and her wrist was raw from the effort. But she had the room's layout memorized, and she had a plan, which was more than she'd had in every moment she'd spent calculating her way out of what David offered her. She was pulling the second wrist loose when the window on the far side of the apartment lit up. Car headlights. Multiple. Then a sound she had no good reference for, not a single shot, but a rapid, overlapping sequence of sounds from the floor below, then the outer room, then the corridor, then silence that lasted long enough to mean something, then footsteps she recognized. Not their pattern exactly, she hadn't catalogued his footsteps with any intention, but their pace, not running, not cautious, moving through a space that has been made available. The door opened. Yaji stood in the frame. His jacket was on. His hair was still immaculate. There was a cut along his left jaw that had not been there this morning, and something dark on the sleeve of the jacket that she identified and did not name. His eyes went to her hands first, her wrists, the fraying zip tie, and something moved across his face too quickly for her to catch. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and his hands closed around hers. She looked up at him. "I was almost out," she said. He looked at the half-freed zip tie, then at her. Something rearranged itself in his expression, not quite humor, not quite awe, but adjacent to both. "I know," he said. He broke the remaining plastic with 2 fingers and let it fall. His hands stayed around hers. She could feel the tension in them, the extraordinary effort of a man who had moved through the last 40 minutes at a temperature no one near him could survive, now pulling himself back down to something she could be in the same room with. She turned her palms up and held his hands back. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She did not ask how. She had read the folder. She understood the range of what yes could mean from him, and she had made her peace with that not easily, and not dishonestly, but completely. "Take me home," she said. He looked at her for a moment, with something in his face that was entirely unguarded, entirely unperformed, and entirely new, the expression of a man who has just heard a word applied to a place that he had not, until that moment, thought of as home. He didn't say anything. He kept her hands in his and turned toward the door, and she walked with him through the apartment and down the stairs and out into the night air. In the weeks that followed, the city rearranged itself. Not visibly. Not in the way cities rearrange themselves when something obvious has shifted. It happened in the substrate, in the particular conversations that did not take place at certain tables, in the names that disappeared from certain organizational charts, in the way men who had spent years building leverage against Yaji found that leverage quietly, thoroughly gone. The syndicate did not fracture. It consolidated. The consolidation was absolute and took exactly 11 days, which was how long it took to ensure that every person who had voted with their silence for what Cho had done understood precisely what that vote had cost them. Cho himself was not discussed, not by anyone who valued the use of their voice. Lily watched it happen from inside the estate and from inside Yaji's life, which were increasingly the same thing. Mrs. Shin had stopped introducing herself as the housekeeper somewhere around the 2nd week. She simply moved through the same spaces Lily moved through, and occasionally left tea outside the study door without being asked, and that was its own kind of welcome. She went back to her apartment twice, once for the rest of her things, once to give notice on the lease. She did not experience either visit as loss. She experienced them as she was beginning to experience most things, with clarity and without the particular exhausted hypervigilance that had been her internal weather for 3 years. The exits were still the first thing she clocked in every room. She suspected that would not change. She had stopped needing it to. She was present the morning Yaji received word that the last of the syndicate's dissenting structure had been formally absorbed. He was at his desk. She was in the chair by the window. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he set the phone down, he looked at her, and she looked back. "It's done," he said, the same 2 words. His vocabulary for completions was sparse and consistent. "All of it?" "All of it." She uncrossed her legs and stood up and crossed the room and sat on the corner of his desk, which was something she'd started doing recently because it pleased her, and because the first time she'd done it, he had looked at her with that flash of unguarded something, and she had decided she liked having access to his prose. Unguarded expressions. "What happens now?" she asked. He leaned back. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, like the only person in the room worth seeing, except now there was nothing underneath it that he was managing. No professional distance. No careful calibration of what she could be allowed to know. Just Yaji, looking at Lily, and the city below, and the morning light coming through glass. "Now you stay," he said. "I already told you I was staying." "I know," he said. "I like hearing it." She looked at him. That was possibly the most personal thing he had ever said to her without her excavating it first. She stored it carefully in the part of her that was building a new archive to replace the old one, the one that had been full of David's particular kind of evidence, the kind that proved she was small and temporary and easily frightened. This archive was different. It was filling slowly, with precise things, the way he had rearranged his own movement through his house, the folder with her name on the foundation, the 4 seconds of absolute stillness before he had walked out to get her back, his hands around hers in that stripped apartment room. She reached out and touched the back of his hand. The tattoos were warm under her fingers. "Tell me one more," she said. She did this, sometimes asked about the ink when she wanted to be close to him without having to explain that was what she wanted. It had become their language for something neither of them had named yet, and they were both, in their separate ways, in no rush. He turned his hand over. He pointed to a mark on the inside of his wrist, small, geometric, older than the rest. "This was not the organization," he said. "This was before. My mother's family had a symbol. I was 17. She looked at it. A small thing, barely larger than a coin, sitting underneath 20 years of everything that had come after. "It's the oldest one," she said. "Yes." She kept her finger on it for a moment. She thought about 17, and mothers, and the things people carry forward that are not about power or rank or the record of what they've survived. She thought about the Lily Morgan Foundation for Domestic Abuse Survivors, which had now been running for nearly 2 weeks and had already received its first intake of referrals. She thought about what it meant to have your name on something that helped people instead of on something that cataloged what had been done to you. She thought about the fact that she was sitting on the corner of a crime lord's desk in a house she had chosen, in a city she now moved through without checking every shadow, with her finger resting on the oldest thing he had ever let her see. She was not the woman who had been pressed against a marble balustrade, with the city blurring 40 floors below. She was not the woman who had spent 8 months changing her phone number and her address and the way she wore her hair, trying to become someone David couldn't find. She was not afraid, and she was not hiding, and she was not small. Yaji looked at her hand on his wrist. He looked up at her face. He said nothing, because nothing was required. Outside, the city moved through its morning, its deals and its traffic, and its 1,000 private dramas, its corruption and its grace, its ordinary people doing ordinary things in the streets below a house they would never have access to. And in that house, at the top of everything, Lily Morgan sat with her finger on the oldest mark and her back straight and her eyes open, and she was no longer running. She was exactly where she had chosen to be. Untouchable. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I would love to say hello to you and know just how far our story is traveling. Do you think Lily can truly survive loving a man whose empire has no safe edges? And what do you think Yaji is still hiding about the real reason he was watching her that night before David ever raised his hand? Like this, if you are completely obsessed with this slow burn between a woman who refused to stay broken and the most dangerous man in the city, because this story is only getting darker, and the next chapter will change everything you think you know. See you there, if Lily and Yaji can hold their empire together before the shadows they buried come crawling back to the surface.